Production by Liang Gu, The Invisible Man, author, Herbert George Wells. Chapter 1: The Arrival of the First Stranger. On a cold day in early February, the stranger braved the biting cold wind and flying snowflakes to embark on the last journey of last year. Snow. Walking through the wilderness, walking from Bramblehurst train station, clutching a small black leather suitcase. He was wrapped tightly from head to toe, and the brim of his soft felt hat covered every inch of his face, leaving only the shining tip of his nose exposed. Snowflakes piled on his shoulders and chest, adding a white peak to his burden. He staggered into the Coach and Horse Inn, deader than alive, and dropped his suitcase on the floor. "Come and light a fire," he cried, "for the charity of mankind." A room and a fire. He stomped around the bar, shook the snow off his body, and followed Mrs. Hall into her living room to discuss the deal. With that, and a few gold coins thrown on the table, he settled in the hotel. The lady lit the fire and left him there. I personally prepared a meal for him. A guest staying in Yiping during the winter is a rare piece of good fortune, let alone one who is not a bargainer, and she is determined to prove herself worthy of the good fortune. While the bacon has started cooking. Her lymph maid, Millie, a little stirred by some well-chosen contemptuous words, entered the drawing room with tablecloths, plates, and glasses, and began to lay them out with great spectacle. Although the fire is strong. She was surprised to see that her visitor, still wearing his hat and coat, had his back to her, staring out the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were clasped together, as if deep in thought. She noticed the melting snow still falling on his shoulders, dripping onto her carpet. "Can I get your hat and coat, sir?" she said. "Take them to the kitchen and dry them properly?" "No," he said without turning around. She wasn't sure if she heard him and was about to repeat her question. He turned and looked over his shoulder. "I prefer wearing them," he said emphatically, and she noticed that he wore large blue-rimmed glasses with a thick side mustache above his collar that completely obscured his cheeks and face. "Very well, sir," she said. "As long as you like it. The room will be warm in a while." He didn't answer and turned away again. Mrs. Hall felt that the timing of her conversation was wrong, quickly placed the things on the table, and then hurriedly left the room. When she came back, he was still there. The man looks like a stone, with his back bent, his collar turned up, and the water droplets on the brim of his hat hanging down, completely covering his face and ears. She put the eggs and bacon down hard and shouted to him instead of saying, "Sir, your lunch is ready." "Thank you," he said at the same time. She didn't move until she closed the door. Then he turned quickly and walked towards the table with an eager step. As she walked to the kitchen behind the bar, she heard a voice repeating at regular intervals, "Zilke, Zilke, Zilke." The sound was the sound of a spoon stirring rapidly in a basin. "That girl," she said. "Look. I totally forgot. It took her so long to make it." As she finished mixing the mustard herself, she gave Millie a few words of verbal rebuke for her slowness. She cooked the ham and eggs, set the table and did everything while Millie, what a help, only succeeded in delaying the mustard. "And he also has a new guest who wants to stay." Then she filled the mustard jar. Putting it on a gold and black tea tray in a solemn gesture, he carried it into the living room. She knocked on the door and came in quickly. Just then her visitor moved so quickly that she only caught a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It looked like he was picking something off the floor. She tapped the mustard jar on the table, then noticed that her coat and hat had been removed and placed on the chair in front of the fire, a pair of wet boots threatening to rust her steel fenders. She walked resolutely towards these things. "I think I'll take them to dry now," she said in a tone that brooked no refusal. "Take off your hat," said her visitor in a slurred voice, and turning around she saw that he had raised his head and was sitting looking at her. She was stunned for a moment, staring at him dumbfounded, too surprised to speak. He was holding a piece of white cloth, the napkin he carried, covering the lower part of his face so that his mouth and chin were completely covered, which was why his voice was hoarse. But that wasn't what frightened Mrs. Hall. What really surprised her was that his entire forehead above his blue glasses was covered by a white bandage, and another covered his ears, except for his pink, pointy nose. No part of his face is exposed. That pink, bright, shiny nose is just like it was in the beginning. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high collar, black linen lining, and lapels around his neck. Thick black hair escaped from beneath and between the crisscrossing bandages to form strange tails and horns, giving him an unimaginably grotesque appearance. The masked and bandaged head was nothing like he expected. So much so that she froze there for a moment. He did not take the napkin away, but continued to hold it, as she saw now, a brown-gloved hand looking at her through unreadable blue spectacles. "Hand down your hat," he said. "Speak clearly through the white cloth." Her nerves began to recover from the shock. She placed her hat again on the chair by the fire. "I don't know, sir," she began, then she paused awkwardly. "Thank you," he said dryly. His eyes moved from her to the door, then back to her. "I'll dry them well at once, sir," she said, and took his clothes out of the room. She glanced once more at his white-wrapped head and blue goggles as she walked out. But his napkin remained in front of his face. After she closed the door, she couldn't help but shudder, her face full of surprise and confusion. "I never," she whispered. "That's it." She walked softly to the kitchen, too absorbed in her own thoughts when she got there. "So much so that I didn't ask Millie what she was busy with now." The visitor sat down and listened to her retreating footsteps. He looked out the window curiously before setting down his napkin and continuing with his meal. He took a bite, looked out the window suspiciously, took another bite, and then stood up. Napkin in hand, you crossed the room and drew the curtains to the tops of the white linen that covered the window below. This plunged the room into dusk. After doing this, he returned to the table with a relaxed tone and continued to eat. "That poor soul had been in an accident or had an operation or something," said Mrs. Hall. "What a fright those bandages gave me." She added some coal, unfolded the hanger, and put the traveler's coat on it. "And those goggles, goops. He looks more like a diving helmet than an ordinary person." She hung his scarf on a corner of the hanger and kept covering her mouth with a handkerchief. "Talk through the handkerchief. Maybe his mouth was hurt too, maybe." She turned around, like suddenly remembering something. "My soul," she said, suddenly digressing, "Millie, aren't the potatoes ready yet?" As Mrs. Hall went to clear the stranger's lunch, Her idea that his mouth must also have been cut or deformed in what she believed to be the accident was confirmed by the fact that he was smoking a pipe and that during the entire time she was in the room he never untied the silk scarf covering the lower part of his face. Put the cigarette holder to your mouth. It was not forgetfulness, however, for she saw him glance at the cigarette as it burned out. He sat in the corner with his back to the curtain, now talking, having eaten and drank, and feeling comfortably warm. Less invasive simplicity than before. The reflection of the firelight gave his large glasses a red vitality that they had lacked before. "I have some luggage," he said, "at Bramblehurst Station." Then he asked her how he could get the luggage delivered. He bowed his head politely to show his approval of her explanation. "Tomorrow," he said. "Isn't there a faster way?" He seemed disappointed when she answered, "No." "Is she sure?" "No one with a trap would get past it." Mrs. Hall answered his questions without hesitation and started a conversation. "That's a steep downhill, sir," she said in response to a question about traps, then took a chance. Said, "There was a carriage overturning accident there more than a year ago. A gentleman was killed, as well as his coachman." "Sir, accidents always happen in an instant, don't they? But it's not easy for visitors." Attracted. "They do," he said through the scarf. Then he looked at her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. "But they recovered slowly, didn't they? This is my sister's son Tom." He cut his arm with a scythe and fell down in the field. Oops. He was tied up for 3 months. You can hardly believe it. That gave me a fear of scythes, sir. I can totally understand that, the visitor said. He had been afraid that he would need surgery. He was in really bad shape, sir. The visitor suddenly burst into laughter, like a dog barking. He seemed to bite and strangle it in his mouth. "Really?" he said. He was, sir. To them, it was not a laughing matter because what he was doing, and what I was doing, was that my sister was taking up so much of her time with her kids. Gentlemen. There are bandages to put on and bandages to take off. So, if I may boldly say, Sir Dash. Can you get me some matches? Said the visitor suddenly. My pipe is out of fire. Mrs. Hall was suddenly pulled rise. After he told her what he had done. It's really rude to do this, she exclaimed to him for a moment, remembering the 2 gold coins. She picked up the match. Thank you, he said tersely, and when she set them down, he turned his back to her and looked out the window again. This is so frustrating. Apparently he was sensitive to the subject of surgery and bandages. However, she didn't say it so boldly, after all. But his snubbing way annoyed her, and Millie had a very bad afternoon. The visitor remained in the drawing room until 4 o'clock. No excuse was given for intrusion. He was quiet for much of this period. It looked like he was sitting in the darkening room, smoking by the light of the fire, perhaps dozing. Once or twice the curious listener might have heard him by the fire. For 5 minutes he could hear voices pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then the armchair creaked as he sat down again. Chapter 2 Mr. Teddy Humphrey's first impression. At 4 o'clock, it was already quite dark. Just as Mrs. Hall worked up the courage to go in and ask her visitor if he wanted tea, Teddy Humphrey, the clockmaker, entered the bar. "Gee, Mrs. Hall," he said, but it's too bad to wear thin boots in this weather." The snow was falling faster and faster outside. Mrs. Hall agreed, then noticed he was carrying a bag. "You are here now, Mr. Teddy," she said, "and I would be glad if you would look at the old clock in the drawing room. It runs well and strikes hard, but the hour hand will only point to 6 o'clock." She walked in front. He walked to the living room door, knocked and went in. Her visitor, whom she saw when she opened the door, was sitting in an armchair before the fire, seemingly dozing, his bandaged head tilted to one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire. The light illuminated his eyes like a reverse railroad signal, but his downcast face was plunged into darkness, and the remnants of the faint daylight that entered through the open door. To her, everything is ruddy, blurry, and unclear. Especially since she had just turned on the bar lights and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second, she thought the man she saw had a huge mouth gaping open, a mouth so vast and incredible that it swallowed the lower half of his face. It's a momentary feeling, the white headband, the monster's bespectacled eyes, and this giant yawn beneath it. Then he stirred, rising from his chair and raising his hands. She opened the door wide, making the room brighter, and she could see him more clearly. Just like she'd seen before, the scarf was pulled over his face. She felt that the shadow had deceived her. "Sir, would you mind if this gentleman came over and looked at this clock, sir?" she said after recovering from her brief shock. "Look at the clock," he said. While looking around drowsily, he covered his mouth with his hand, and then, fully awake, he said, "Of course." Mrs. Hall left to get the lamp, and he stood up and stretched. Then the lights came on and Mr. Teddy Henfry came in. "Face this bandaged man." He said he was surprised. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, looking at him as Mr. Humphrey said, with a vivid impression of the dark spectacles like a lobster. "I hope," said Mr. Humphrey, "that this is not an intrusion." "Nothing," said the stranger. "But I understand," he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, "that this room is indeed given to me, for my private use." "I think, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "you might prefer that clock." "Of course," said the stranger, "of course. But, as a rule, I like to be alone." Uninterrupted. "But I'm really glad the clock got taken care of," he said, seeing a hint of hesitation in Mr. Humphrey's demeanor. "Very pleased." Mr. Humphrey was tempted to apologize and retreat, but the anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned his back to the fireplace. "Put your hands behind your back. And," he said, "when the clock is repaired, I think I should like some tea. But not before." Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. This time she did not do anything chat, for she did not wish to be treated coldly in the presence of Mr. Henfry, when her visitor asked her whether she had made arrangements for his trunk at Bramblehurst. She told him that she had mentioned it to the postman. "The movers can bring them tomorrow." "Are you sure this is the earliest time?" he asked. She assured, with apparent indifference. "I should explain," he added, "something that I had not been able to do before because I was too cold and tired, and that is that I am an experimental investigator." "Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, impressed. "My luggage contains equipment and utensils." "Very useful stuff indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall. "I am quite naturally anxious to continue my inquiries." "Of course, sir," the reason why I came to Yiping." He continued with a thoughtful attitude, "It's the desire to be alone. I don't want to be disturbed while I'm working. Besides my work, there was an accident dash." "I think so too," Mrs. Hall said to herself. "Needs a certain amount of retirement. My eyes." Sometimes it was so debilitating and painful that I had to shut myself in the dark for hours on end. Lock yourself up. Sometimes, occasionally. Of course not now. At such moments, any slightest interruption, the entry of a stranger into the room, are an intolerable annoyance to me. It is only natural that these things should be understood. "Of course, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "if I may venture to ask." "I think that is enough," said the stranger, with that air of calm and irresistible determination that he could display at will. Mrs. Hall saved her questions and sympathy for a better time. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he stood before the fire, staring, as Mr. Humphrey said, staring at the repair of the clock. Mr. Humphrey not only removed the clock's hands and dial, but also the movement. He worked as slowly, quietly, and humbly as possible. He worked close to the lamp, its green shade casting a bright light on his hands, and on frames and wheels, while the rest of the room appears gloomy. When he looked up, colorful spots appeared in his eyes. Due to his natural curiosity, he dismantled the movement, a completely unnecessary practice, in order to delay his departure. Maybe talk to strangers. But there the stranger stood, utterly silent and still. It was so still that Humphrey felt uneasy. He felt that he was alone in the room. He looked up and saw, dark and blurry, a bandaged head and huge blue lenses. Staring firmly, green spots floated ahead. This was very eerie to Humphrey, and they stared at each other for a moment. Then Humphrey lowered his head again. Very uncomfortable position. "I really want to find a topic to talk about." Should he comment? Very cold weather for this season? He raised his head as if to aim for the opening shot. "The weather," he began. "Why don't you just finish it and leave?" said the stiff figure, obviously in a state of painfully suppressed anger. "You just need to hold the hour hand on the axis. You're just talking nonsense." "Of course, sir, just one more minute." "I was remiss," and Mr. Humphrey went away. But he went away feeling extremely troubled. Mr. Humphrey said to himself, "Damn it." While stepping on the melting snow towards the village, a man has to repair a clock from time to time. He must do it. Here it is again. Can't a man look at you? Ugly. It seems no. If the police want to arrest you, you cannot wrap yourself up more or tie you up more. At the corner of Gleason he saw Hall, who had lately been married to the stranger's mistress, the carriage and horses, and who now occasionally drove Epping's conveyance to Hidbury when needed. Strange intersection. He was coming back from that place and coming towards him. It was clear from the way he was driving that Hall was stopping at Hidbridge. "How are you, Teddy?" he said as he passed. "You had a drink at home," said Teddy. Hall stopped very graciously. "What is that?" he asked. What looked like drunkards stopped at the carriage and horse, said Teddy. "Oh my God." He went on to give Hall a vivid description of his strange guest. "It looks a bit like a costume, doesn't it? If he stops at my place." I want to see a man's face, Humphrey said. But women are just so trusting, to strangers. He took your room and didn't even leave a name, Hall. You said so. Hall said he was slow to react. Yes, said Teddy. A week at most. No matter who he is, you can't get rid of him within a week. And he said he would bring a lot of luggage tomorrow, so. I hope there aren't rocks in the box, Hall. He told Hall. Anton Hastings was scammed by a stranger with an empty suitcase. Overall, it left Hall a little skeptical. Get up, old girl, Hall said. I guess I have to go take a look at this. Teddy dragged his heavy steps forward, feeling quite relieved. However, on his return home, Hall was severely criticized by his wife for staying too long at Sidderbridge, and his mild inquiries were met with brief and to-the-point answers. Despite this, the seeds of doubt sown by Teddy took root in Mr. Hall's mind. You women don't know everything, said Mr. Hall, who was determined to get to know his guest's character as soon as possible. It was about 9:30 after the stranger went to bed. Mr. Hall entered the drawing room very actively, looked at his wife's furniture carefully to show that the stranger was not the owner of the place, and examined with a hint of contempt the mathematical calculation paper left by the stranger. That night before he went to bed, Mr. Hall entered the drawing room very actively, looked at his wife's furniture carefully to show that the stranger was not the owner of the place, and examined with a hint of contempt the mathematical calculation paper left by the stranger. That night before he went to bed, Mrs. Hall was instructed to look carefully at the stranger's luggage the next day. Mind your own business, Hall, said Mrs. Hall, and I'll mind mine. She was more inclined to be angry with Hall, for the stranger was undoubtedly a very strange stranger. She didn't have any confidence in him either. Waking up in the middle of the night, she dreamed of a huge white head following her like a turnip, with a long neck and big black eyes. But as a rational woman, she suppressed her fears, turned over and went back to sleep. Chapter 3 1001 Bottles. So, on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this extraordinary man fell from Infinity to Yipping Village. The next day, his luggage arrived through the mud, and it was a sight to behold. There were 2 boxes, indeed, as a reasonable person might need, but beyond that there was a box full of books, big, thick books, some with illegible writing, and a dozen or more lots of wooden crates, boxes. Inside were items wrapped in straw, which Hall seemed to be tugging at with a sense of casual curiosity, glass bottles. Strangers in hats, coats, gloves, and shawls came out impatiently to meet Fearenside's carriage, while Hall made small talk. Be prepared to help them move their luggage inside. He came out without noticing Fearenside's dog, which was sniffing Hall's thigh with the air of an amateur. Take those boxes with you, he said, I've waited too long. He went down the stairs. He walked towards the back of the car, as if he was going to lift the smaller crate. As soon as Fearenside's dog saw him, it immediately bristled and growled fiercely. The dog jumped hesitantly as he rushed down the stairs. Then he lunged toward his hand. Bah! Cried Hall, jumping back, for he was no hero to dogs, and Fearenside shouted, Get down, and snatched up the whip. They saw the dog's teeth slip from their hands and heard a kick. The dog is seen performing a side jump and jumps into the stranger's lap, and his pants are heard being ripped. Then the tip of Fearenside's whip touched his property, and the dog shrieked in terror and retreated under the wheels of the carriage. This all happens in just half a minute. No one spoke, everyone shouted. The stranger glanced briefly at his torn glove and at his leg, as if stooping to examine the latter, then turned and ran quickly up the stairs and into the hotel. They heard him running down the hall and up the uncarpeted stairs to his room without looking back. "You bastard," said Fearenside, jumping out of the car with a whip in his hand, while the dog looked at him through the wheels. "Come here," said Fearenside, "you'd better do it." Hall stood stunned. He was bitten, Hall said. "I'd better go and see," and he ran after the stranger. He met Mrs. Hall in the corridor. "The carrier is in danger," he said, "bitten." He went straight upstairs. The stranger's door was ajar, and he pushed it open. He walked in without any inhibitions because he was naturally compassionate. The blind man's curtain was lowered, and the room was dark. He caught a glimpse of something very peculiar, what seemed to be a handless arm waving to him, and 3 large uncertain spots on a white face, very much like a pale pansy. Then he was struck hard in the chest, thrown back, and the door slammed and locked in his face. It all happened so fast that he didn't have time to observe. An indecipherable shape of a swing, a blow, then a crash. He stood on the small dark staircase, wondering what he might have seen. A few minutes later he rejoined the small group that had formed outside the carriage and horses. Fearenside was telling all this for the second time. Mrs. Hall said there was no reason for his dog to bite her guest. Hexter, the grocer from across the road, was asking questions, and Sandy Vodgers from the blacksmith's shop was asking questions. Appeared just, except women and children. They all say stupid things. "It won't bite me, I know it, this kind of dog is wrong, why does it bite," etc. Mr. Hall stood on the steps, gazing at them, listening, and found himself witnessing something so extraordinary upstairs. This made him feel incredible. Furthermore, his vocabulary was too limited to express what he was feeling. "He doesn't want any help," he said. He responded to his wife's inquiry. "We'd better help him get his luggage inside. He should be cauterized immediately. Especially if it has any inflammation," Mr. Huck said. "I'll shoot it, I'll do it," said a woman in the group. Suddenly, the dog started barking again. "Come in quickly," an angry voice came from the door. A man stood with his collar turned up. A stranger with a lowered hat brim. "The sooner you get those things in, the happier I'll be," said an anonymous onlooker, whose pants and gloves had already been changed. "Are you hurt, sir?" asked Fearenside. "I'm very sorry, that big." "Not at all," said the stranger. "Never broke the skin. Hurry up those things." He then swore to himself, as Mr. Hall asserted. He directly moved the first box into the living room according to his instructions. The stranger jumped on it with great excitement and began to unpack it. Completely ignoring Mrs. Hall's rug, she scattered the straw all over the floor. Then he took out bottles from the box, small, plump bottles for powders, slender bottles for colored and white liquids, ribbed blue bottles with "poison" written on them, bottles with round bellies and narrow necks. Large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frost labels, bottles with thin corks, bottles with wooden stoppers, wine bottles, salad oil bottles. Put them in a row, place on the dresser, on the mantel, on the table under the window. Around the floor, on the bookshelves, everywhere. Bramble Hill won't have as many pharmacies. The sight was truly spectacular. Box after box was opened until all 6 boxes were empty and the table was covered with straw, except for the bottles. Some test tubes and a carefully packaged scale were also taken out of these boxes. Opening the crate directly, the stranger went to the window and began to work, paying attention to the scattering of straw, the extinguished fire, the boxes of books outside, and the suitcases and other packages that had been carried upstairs. None of them cared. When Mrs. Hall brought in his supper, he was so immersed in his work, pouring little drops of liquid from the bottle into the test tubes, that it was not until she had cleared away most of the straw and put the tray on the table that, perhaps with some emphasis, he didn't hear her voice until he saw how dirty the floor was. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned away again. But she saw that he had taken off his spectacles. They were on the table beside him, and his eye sockets seemed to her particularly hollow. He put his glasses on again and turned to face her. She was about to complain about the straw on the floor, but he forestalled her. "I wish you wouldn't come in without saying hello," he said in that unusually exasperated tone that seemed to suit his personality. "I knocked on the door, but it seemed, maybe you did. But while I was doing, in the midst of my truly urgent and necessary investigation, any slightest disturbance, a banging of the door, I must ask you. Of course, sir. You can turn the lock if you want that, you know. Any time." "That's a very good idea," said the stranger. "This house, sir, if I may venture to say, don't. If the straws cause trouble, count them in the account." He said to her vaguely. It sounded like a curse. He stood there, so strange, so aggressive and explosive, with the bottle in one hand. The other hand held a test tube, much to Mrs. Hall's alarm. But she is a determined woman. "In this case, I should like to know, sir, what do you think dash? A shilling, lay down a shilling. Isn't 1 shilling enough?" "Just so be it," said Mrs. Hall. "Take the tablecloth and start spreading it on the table. If you're satisfied, of course dash." He turned around and sat down, his coat collar facing her. He worked all afternoon behind closed doors and, as Mrs. Hall testified, mostly in silence. But once there was a collision, a clatter of bottles as if the table had been hit, then a bottle was slammed to the floor, and the room paced rapidly back and forth. Worried that something happened, she went to the door to listen, not wanting to knock. "I can't continue," he shouted frantically. "I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000. Huge crowd. Being cheated. It might take me my whole life. Patience. Indeed, patience. Stupid. Stupid." Bricks in the bar. There was a noise of iron nails, and Mrs. Hall reluctantly interrupted his monologue. When she returned, the room was quiet again, save for the slight scrape of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had gone back to work. When she picked up his tea, she saw broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been wiped carelessly. She got everyone's attention. "Put it on the bill," snapped her visitor, "and for God's sake leave me alone." If damage is done, put it on the bill, and he went on to draw a list on the exercise book in front of him. I'm going to tell you something, said Fearenside mysteriously. By then it was evening, and they were in a small beer hall in Ipinghanger. Huh? Teddy Humphrey asked. The man you're talking about was bitten by my dog. Well, he was black. At least, his legs were. I saw it through the holes in his pants and the holes in his gloves. Do you think it's gonna show a little bit of pink, right? No, I'm telling you. His hat is as black as mine. Oops. This is totally a red nose case, Humphrey said. Heck, his nose is as red as paint. That's true, said Fearenside, I know it. I'll tell you what I'm thinking. That horse is a piebald horse, Teddy. Black here, white there. Piece by piece. He was ashamed of it. He is a half-blood and the colors do not blend but become mottled. I've heard of this happening before. This is common in horses and can be seen by anyone. Chapter 4 Mr. Strange interviews a stranger. I have given a detailed account of the stranger's arrival at Epping, that the reader may understand the curious impression which he made. Except for two strange incidents. The circumstances of his stay up to that unusual day of the club's festival can be passed over very briefly. He had some minor conflicts with Mrs. Hall over household discipline, but by the end of April, before the signs of poverty began to show, he always easily outshone Mrs. Hall by paying extra. Mrs. Hall disliked him, and whenever opportunity arose he would talk of the necessity of firing him, but he concealed his dislike chiefly by being conspicuous. Show displeasure by avoiding contact with the visitor as much as possible. Wait until the summer, Mrs. Hall said wisely, when the artists start arriving. We'll see then. He may be a little arrogant, but a bill paid on time is a bill paid on time. Whatever you want to say. Stranger did not go to church, and there was virtually no difference between Sundays and non-religious days, not even in dress. He worked, as Mrs. Hall thought, very precariously. Some days he would come down early. Always busy. Other days he would get up late, pace the room, fuss loudly for hours, smoke, and sleep in an armchair by the fire. He has no communication with the world outside the village. His temper had always been very unstable. Most of the time his attitude is that of a man who can barely stand provocation, and sometimes things snap, tear, crush or shatter. He seemed to be under a state of extreme chronic irritation. He gradually developed the habit of talking to himself in a low voice. Although Mrs. Hall listened carefully, she could not understand what she heard. He rarely goes abroad during the day, but at dusk, he will go out bundled up and almost invisible. Regardless of whether the weather is cold or not, he will choose the most remote roads. Those shaded by trees and riverbanks. His spectacles and hideous bandaged face, looming under his hat, suddenly appeared out of the darkness to one or two of the workmen who were returning home, and Teddy Humphrey, on a 9:30 night from. The man fell out of the red coat, and was frightened by the stranger's skeleton-like head. He was holding a hat in his hand, because of the sudden opening of the hotel door. Those who saw him at dusk, at night, would dream about ghosts. It seemed difficult to tell whether they hated the boy more than he did, or vice versa, but in any case, sufficient disgust was evident on both sides. Such a person with such outstanding appearance and temperament. It was inevitable that it would become a frequently discussed topic in a village like Yiping. Opinions on his career are divided. Mrs. Hall was very sensitive to this point. When asked, she explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator, repeating these words carefully as if fearing a trap. When asked what an experimental investigator is, she will say with a hint of superiority that most educated people know these things, so she will explain that he finds things, she said. Her visitor had suffered an accident which had temporarily discolored his face and hands, and because of his sensitive nature he was unwilling to let the matter become a public topic. She couldn't hear it, and most people thought he was a criminal. Trying to evade justice by wrapping yourself up and hiding completely from the police. The idea originated in the mind of Mr. Teddy Humphrey. There have been no major crimes since mid-February or the end of February. In the imagination of Mr. Gould, a probationary assistant at the National School, the theory turned out that the stranger was an explosives maker masquerading as an anarchist, who decided to conduct detective work in the time he was allowed. Much of this work involves observing a stranger very carefully when they meet him, or asking people who have never met a stranger to lead them to ask questions about him. But he found no clues. Another school of thought follows Mr. Fearenside. Either accept Zebra's view, or modify it in some way. Silas Duggan, for example, is said to have asserted that, if he chose to display himself in the fair, he would soon be rich, as a man with some theological knowledge people. He compares the stranger to a person who has only one skill. There is also the idea that the stranger is a harmless madman, which explains the whole problem. The advantage of this perspective is that it explains everything at once. Between these major groups, there are waivers and compromisers. The people of Sussex are less superstitious, and it was only after the events of early April that supernatural thoughts quietly circulated in the village. Even so, only women believe it. But no matter what they thought of him, people in Yiping town generally dislike him. His irritability, while perhaps understandable to a city intellectual, was a surprising thing for these quiet Sussex country folk. They would occasionally see his feverish gestures, his hurried steps as night fell, leading him to quiet corners around them, his ruthless defeat of all attempts at curiosity, his preference for dusk that caused doors to be closed and curtains to be drawn. The candles and lamps were extinguished. Who can agree with such behavior? As he passed through the villages they would let him pass, and as he passed the young humorists would follow him with their collars turned up and their hat brims lowered, nervously imitating his mysterious manner. There was a popular song at that time called Ghost. Miss Starcher sang the song in a schoolroom concert, for the church lights, and thereafter whenever a few villagers got together a stranger appeared. Among them they would play a measure or two of the piece, in a more or less sharp or deep tone. In addition, children who arrived late would shout, "Ghost," after him and scurry away excitedly. Curse, the general practitioner, was consumed by curiosity. The bandages aroused his professional interest, and the reports of 1,001 bottles aroused his jealousy. Throughout April and May he longed for a chance to talk to this stranger, and finally, just before Whitsunday, he could stand it no longer. So I used the excuse of subscribing to the list of rural nurses. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall did not know his guest's name. He mentioned a name, said Mrs. Hall, an unfounded assertion, but I didn't catch it. She thought it was stupid not to know the man's name. Cuss shouted loudly at the door of the living room, and then walked in. A rather harsh curse came from inside. "Excuse me for interrupting," Cuss said, and the door closed, cutting off Mrs. Hall's conversation with the others. She could hear murmurings for the next 10 minutes, then a scream, a commotion of footsteps, a chair being thrown aside, a burst of laughter, a quick walk to the door, and Cuss appeared, looking pale. Eyes stared over his shoulder. He left the door open and without looking at her, walked through the hall and down the stairs, and she heard his footsteps hurrying along the road. He has a hat in his hand. She stood behind the door, looking at the open door to the living room. Then she heard the stranger chuckle quietly, and then his footsteps crossed the room. She stood there unable to see his face. The door to the living room slammed shut, and silence returned to the place. Cuss walked straight to the village priest Bunting. "Am I crazy?" Cuss suddenly asked as soon as he entered the shabby little study. "Do I look like a madman?" "What happened?" the priest asked. "Place ammonites on loose pages of upcoming sermons. That guy at the inn dash." "Huh." "Give me something to drink," Cuss said, and he sat down, as his nerves were steadied by a glass of cheap sherry. It was the only drink the good priest could offer, and he told him about the meeting he had just had. "Go in," he gasped, "and start asking for donations to that nurse's fund." When I came in, he put his hands in his pockets and sat awkwardly in his chair. He sniffed. I told him I'd heard he was interested in scientific things. He said yes. Sniffed again. He kept sniffing, obviously he just had a terrible cold. Not surprising, it's so tightly wrapped. I developed the idea of a nurse, all the while remaining alert. Bottle. Chemicals, everywhere. The scales, the test tubes on the rack, and the smell of late mulberry. Will he donate? Said he would consider it. I asked him point blank whether he was conducting research. He said he was there. A long study? He became very angry. "This damn long study," he said, blowing the cork off the bottle. "Oh," I said. And then came his complaint. The man was just boiling, and my questions made him boil. He gave me a prescription, a very valuable prescription. He didn't say what it was for. "Is it medical?" "Damn. What are you planning?" I apologized. He sniffed and coughed a bit haughtily. He continued talking. He has read it. 5 ingredients. Put down, turn your head. Air blowing in from the window lifts the paper. Whistling, rustling. He said he worked in a room with an open fireplace. Saw a flash and the prescription was burning and rising up the chimney. Rushed towards it just as it is swept up the chimney. So, at that moment, to illustrate his story, his arm was extended. Terribly sorry. You did not provide source text for translation. Please provide the text you would like translated into simplified Chinese so I can translate it for you. Huh. No hands, just empty sleeves. Oh my God. I thought that was a deformity. Probably a wooden arm. He took it off. And then I thought, this is kind of weird. If there's nothing inside, what's keeping the sleeves up and open? I'm telling you, there's nothing in there, all the way to the bottom. I could see all the way up to my elbows, a sliver of light peeking through a rip in the cloth. OMG, I said. Then he stopped, staring at me with his black goggles, then at his sleeves. That's all. He didn't say a word, he just stared and quickly put his sleeve back into his pocket. What I'm saying is, he said, the prescription is burned. No? A questioning cough. How could you, I said, move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeves? Yes, I said, an empty sleeve. It's an empty sleeve, isn't it? Did you see its empty sleeve? He stood up immediately. I stood up too. He took 3 slow steps toward me and stood very close. He sniffed viciously. Although I bet his bandaged head and those blindfolds would be enough to unnerve anyone, he approaches you silently. You said it was an empty sleeve, he said. Of course. I said. A cheeky man, without glasses, started scratching. Then very quietly he took his sleeve out of his pocket again and raised his arm toward me, as if to show me again. He did it very, very slowly. I looked at him. It seemed like a long time. I said. Clearing his throat, there's nothing in there. What had to be said? I started to get scared. I could see all the way to the bottom. Slowly, slowly he reached towards me, like that, until the handcuffs were only 6 inches from my face. Seeing empty sleeves coming at you like that. What a strange thing. Then. Something, it felt like a finger and a thumb, pinched my nose. Boonin began to laugh. There is nothing there. Cuss said, his voice rising to a scream at the word, there. You have a good laugh, but I'm telling you, I was so scared. I gave him a hard slap on the sleeve, turned and ran out of the room. I left him there. The swearing stopped. His panic was unmistakable. He turned around helplessly, had another glass of the good Vickers Bad Sherry, while I struck him on the sleeve. Cuss said, I'm telling you, it felt like a slap in the arm. But there was no arm there. There wasn't even a shadow of an arm. Mr. Boonin thought for a moment. He looked at Cussy suspiciously. It's a pretty remarkable story, he said. He does look very smart and serious. Indeed, said Mr. Boonin in a judicial tone, it is a very remarkable story. Chapter 5: The Theft of the Abbot. The facts of the burglary of the church parsonage are told to us chiefly through the minister and his wife. The theft occurred in the early hours of Trinity Day, during a club celebration in the village of Iping. It seemed as if Mrs. Boonin suddenly awoke in the pre-dawn silence. The intense feeling of their bedroom door opening and closing. At first she did not wake her husband, but sat up and listened. Then she distinctly heard bare feet stomping out of the adjacent dressing room and down the corridor toward the stairs. After she was convinced of this, the intense feeling of their bedroom door opening and closing. At first she did not wake her husband, but sat up and listened. Then she distinctly heard bare feet stomping out of the adjacent dressing room and down the corridor toward the stairs. After she was convinced of this, she woke the Reverend Mr. Boonin as gently as she could. Instead of turning on the light, he put on his glasses, put on her nightgown and his shower shoes, and walked up to listen. He distinctly heard a fumbling sound in the study downstairs, followed by a strong sneeze. After that, he returned to his bedroom, picked up his most obvious weapon, the poker, and made his way downstairs as quietly as possible. Mrs. Bunting appeared on the landing. About 4 o'clock, the ultimate darkness of the night had passed. There was a faint flicker of light in the hall, but the doorway to the study was dark and impenetrable. All was quiet except for the slight creak of Mr. Bunting's footsteps down the stairs and the slightest movement in the study. Then, suddenly something broke. The drawer was opened and there was a rustle of paper. Then there was a curse, the match was struck, and the study was illuminated by yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack in the door he could see the desk with its open drawers, and the candle burning on the table. But he couldn't see the thief. As he stood in the hall hesitating, not knowing what to do, Mrs. Bunting, pale and attentive, followed him slowly downstairs. One thing kept Mr. Bunting's courage. That was the belief that the thief was a resident of the village. They heard the jingle of coins and realized that the robbers had found the steward's stash of gold, £2 10 shillings in total, all in half-pound coins. At this sound Mr. Bunting sprang into action. Holding the poker tightly, he rushed into the room, followed by Mrs. Bunting. "Surrender," cried Mr. Bunting, and bowed in surprise. Apparently, the room was empty. However, they firmly believed that they heard someone moving in the room at that moment. This has become a certainty. For perhaps half a minute they stood gaping, then Mrs. Bunting crossed the room and looked behind the screen, and Mr. Bunting, feeling a similar impulse, peered under the table. Then Mrs. Bunting closed the curtains. Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed with his poker. Mrs. Bunting then examined the wastebasket carefully, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid of the coal hopper. Then they stopped and asked each other with their eyes. "I swear," said Mr. Bunting. "Candle," said Mr. Bunting. "Who lit the candle?" "Drawer," said Mrs. Bunting. "The money is gone." She hurried to the door. Of all the strange occurrences, there was a violent sneeze in the corridor. They hurried out just as the kitchen door slammed shut. "Bring the candle," said Mr. Bunting, leading the way. They both heard the hasty locking. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the pantry that the back door had just opened. A faint the light of morning illuminates the dark silhouettes of the garden. He was sure nothing was getting out through the door. The door opened, stayed open for a moment, then slammed shut. Just then the candle Mrs. Bunting was holding from the study flickered and burned. A minute or more after they entered the kitchen. The place was deserted. They relocked the back door, went through the kitchen, storage and pantry, and finally descended to the basement. No matter how much they searched, no one was found in the house. The pastor and his wife in the daylight. The young couple, oddly dressed, were still hanging out on their first floor, illuminated by the inconsequential light of a flickering candle. Chapter 6: The Furious Furniture. Now, on Whitsunday morning, before Millie is kicked out of the house, Mr. and Mrs. Hall both got up and walked quietly down to the basement. Their business there is private and has to do with their beer proportions. They just entered the basement. Mrs. Hall realized she had forgotten to take down a bottle of hops from their shared room. Since she was the expert and primary operator in this area, it was appropriate for Mr. Hall to go upstairs and get it. On the landing, he was surprised to find the stranger's door ajar. He continued into his room and found the bottle as directed. But when he came back with the bottle, he noticed that the bolt on the front door had been shot back and the door was actually just bolted. A flash of inspiration. He related the situation to the stranger's room upstairs and Mr. Teddy Henfrey's suggestion. He distinctly remembered holding a candle while Mrs. Hall locked up the house for the night. Seeing this scene, he stopped. He was stunned, and then went upstairs again, still holding the bottle. He knocked on the stranger's door. No response. He knocked again, then he opened the door and went in. Just as he expected. The bed and the room were also empty. What's even stranger is, even for a man as smart as he was, the bedroom chairs and the edge of the bed were strewn with their guests' clothes, the only ones that he knew of, and their bandages. His big slouch hat was even tilted on the bedpost, looking rather playful. As Hall stood there, he heard his wife's voice coming from deep in the basement, with that rapid scaling of syllables and the last few words of the question rising to a high pitch that West Sussex villagers used to a way of expressing impatience. "George. What are you holding?" At that, he turned and hurried toward her. "Janny," he said, looking over the banister of the basement stairs. Henfrey meant what he said. "He's not in our room, he's not here." The front door was also bolted. At first, Mrs. Hall did not understand, but once she did, she decided to see the empty room for herself. Mr. Hall, still holding the bottle, left first. "If he's not there," he said, "he's near." "Then he's not bringing near. Then what is he doing? That's really weird." As they walked up the basement steps, both thought they heard the front door open and close, but it turned out to be just an illusion and neither mentioned it to each other at the time. Mrs. Hall passed her husband in the corridor and ran upstairs first. Someone sneezed on the stairs. Hall, 6 steps behind, thought he heard a sneeze. She ran up first, thinking Hall was sneezing. She threw the door open and stood looking into the room. "How strange," she said. She heard a slight sniff behind her head, as it seemed, and turned around to see, to her surprise, Hall standing on the top step of the stairs, 12 feet away from her. But in an instant, he was standing next to her. She bent forward and placed her hands on the pillow. "Then reach under the clothes." "Cold," she said, "he's been up for more than an hour." When she did, something very unusual happened. The sheets automatically gathered together, suddenly jumped up to form a mountain peak, and then jumped over the beam at the foot of the bed. It's like someone grabbed them from the middle and threw them aside. Then the stranger's hat jumped off the bedpost, flew in a semicircle through the air, and flew straight into Mrs. Hall's face. Then the sponge flew from the wash basin. Then came the chair, casually throwing the stranger's coat and trousers aside, laughing dryly in a voice that sounded particularly stranger-like, stretching his 4 legs towards Mrs. Hall, seeming to aim at her, and then rushed towards her. She screamed and turned around. Then the chair leg bumped gently but firmly into her back, propelling her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed shut and locked. The chair and bed seemed to do a dance of victory for that moment, and then suddenly everything was calm again. Mrs. Hall almost fainted on the carpet in Mr. Hall's arms. Mr. Hall and Millie, awakened by her screams, had great difficulty in getting her down the stairs, and gave her the recovery drugs usually used in such cases. "She has courage," said Mrs. Hall. "I know she has courage. I read about it in the paper." The tables and chairs jumped and danced. "Have another drink, James." "Nay," Hall said, "this will stabilize you." "Lock him out," said Mrs. Hall, "and don't let him in again." "I half guessed, I probably should have known. He had wide eyes and a bandaged head, and he never went to church on Sundays. And those bottles, more than anyone would need to have. He put his soul into the furniture, my wonderful furniture. It was in that chair that my poor dear mother used to sit when I was a little girl. I didn't expect it to resist me now." "A little more, Janny," Hall said. "Your nerves are frayed." They sent Millie across the street, through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine, to awaken the blacksmith, Mr. Sandy Wodag. Mr. Hall's greeting and the furniture upstairs were unusual. "Wha will Mr. Durg come?" Mr. Wodag is a man of good sense and of great wit. He takes this case very seriously. "If that wasn't witchcraft, my last name wouldn't be Sandy," thought Mr. Sandy Wodag. "You would not provide horseshoes for such a character." He came over very concerned. They wanted him to lead them upstairs to their room, but he didn't seem in a hurry. He preferred to talk in the hallway. Just then Hurst's apprentice came out and began to lower the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion. A few minutes later, Mr. Hurst naturally followed. The Anglo-Saxon genius for parliamentary government was revealed. There was much talk but no decisive action. "Let's talk about the facts first," insisted Mr. Sandy Vogels. "We want to make sure we do the right thing by opening that door. Once a door is destroyed, it is always destructible, but you cannot destroy a door that has already been destroyed." Suddenly, miraculously, the door to the room upstairs opened by itself, and they looked up in surprise. I saw the stranger wearing a hat and a cloak, and his unreasonable blue glass eyes were darker and hollower, walking down the stairs. He came down stiffly and slowly, staring. He continued to stare as he passed through the corridor. Then it stopped. "Look there," he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved fingers and saw a bottle of root beer lying beside the cellar door. Then he walked into the living room and shut the door suddenly, quickly, and fiercely on them. Not a word was said until the final thud died away. They stared at each other. "Well, if that doesn't lick everything clean," said Mr. Wodag, without mentioning the alternative. "I'll go in and ask about it," said Wodgers to Mr. Hall. "I'll ask for an explanation." It took some time to get the landlady's husband to that point. Finally he knocked on the door, opened it, and said, "I'm sorry dash." "Fuck you," said the stranger in a loud voice, and then added, "Close the door after you leave. That's all." The short interview is over. Chapter 7 The Stranger's Revelation. The stranger walked into the small drawing room of the Carriage and Horses at about 5:30 in the morning, and stayed there until about noon, with the curtains drawn and the door closed. After Hall rejected him, no one dared to approach him. He must have been on hunger strike. He rang the bell 3 times in succession, the 3rd time angrily and violently, but no one answered him. "He and his go to hell," said Mrs. Hall. Soon, Incomplete rumors spread about a burglary at the parsonage, and the truth came to light. Hall, with the help of Wodgers, went to Mr. Shuckfoos, the magistrate, to seek his advice. No one dared to go upstairs. How strangers spend their time is unknown. He walked around angrily at times, twice broke into expletives and tore up papers, and violently smashing bottles. The small group of scared but curious people grew. Mrs. Hex came over. Some cheerful young men in black off-the-rack jackets and pinstriped paper ties, for it was a Monday, joined the crowd with confused inquiries. Young Archie Harker expressed himself by walking onto the yard and trying to peek under the blinds. He saw nothing, but gave reasons why he seemed to have seen it, and before long he was joined by some of the young men of Iping. It was the best of all possible Whit Mondays, with nearly a dozen stalls lining the village streets, a shooting gallery and 3 yellow and chocolate carriages parked on the grass next to the blacksmith shop. There are also some male and female tourists playing coconut games. The gentlemen wore blue sweatshirts and the ladies wore white aprons and stylish hats decorated with heavy feathers. From Purple Deer. Wodger and Mr. Jaggers, a shoemaker who sells old second-hand bicycles, are on the road pulling up a string of Union Jacks and royal flags. These flags were originally made to celebrate the anniversary of Queen Victoria's first coronation. In the living room, in the artificial darkness with only a faint ray of light filtering through, the stranger, who we assume is hungry and frightened, hidden in his uncomfortable thermal wrap, looks at his paper through his sunglasses, or banging his dirty little bottle. Occasionally he cursed viciously at the boys outside the window, his voice audible but not visible. Half a dozen broken bottles lay in the corner of the fireplace, and the pungent smell of chlorine polluted the air. This is all we know from what we heard at the time and what we saw in the room later. Around noon, he suddenly opened the door to the living room and stood there staring firmly at the 3 or 4 people in the bar. "Mrs. Hall," he said. Someone called Mrs. Hall awkwardly. Mrs. Hall appeared after a while, a little out of breath, but because of this, she looked even more fierce. "Hall is still outside." She had thought a lot about this scene. He came over holding a small tray with unpaid bills in his hand. "Sir, are you looking for your bill?" she said. "Why wasn't breakfast set? Why didn't you prepare my meal and answer my ringtone? Do you think I can live without eating? Why hasn't my bill been paid yet?" asked Mrs. Hall. "That's what I want to know. I told you 3 days ago that I was waiting for a remittance dash. I told you 2 days ago that I would not wait for any remittance. You won't complain if your breakfast takes a little while. Then my bill has been waiting for 5 days, wouldn't you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly. "Nah, nah," came from the bar. "I would be very grateful to you, sir, if you would stop swearing, sir," said Mrs. Hall. The stranger stood there. Looks more like an angry diving helmet than ever. Everyone in the bar felt that Mrs. Hall had the upper hand. His next words confirmed this. "Look here, my good lady," he began. "Don't call me good girl," Mrs. Hall said. "I already told you that my remittance has not arrived yet." "Remittance is indeed," said Mrs. Hall. "Yet, I dare say that in my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you had nothing on you but a king's silver coin. Well, I found some more dash." "Boola," came from the bar. "I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. That seemed to irritate the stranger greatly. He stamped his foot. "What do you mean?" he said. "I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. "Before I get any bills. Before you eat breakfast or do anything like this, you must tell me a thing or two that I don't understand, and that no one understands, and that everyone is dying to know. I want to know what you did on my chair upstairs. I want to know how your room became empty and how you came in again. Everyone who lives in this house comes in through the door, that's the rule of the house, and you didn't do that, and I want to know how you got in. I still want to know." Suddenly, the stranger raised his clenched glove, stamped his foot, and said with such unusual violence, "Stop," which immediately rendered her speechless. "You don't understand," he said, "who I am and what I do. I'll show you. My God, I'll show you." Then he covered his face with his palms and spoke again, "Move away." The center of his face became a black cave. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed something to Mrs. Hall. She stared at his deformed face and took it automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, threw it away, and stumbled back. "Nose, that's a stranger's nose. Pink and sparkly, rolling on the ground." Then he took off his glasses, and everyone in the bar exclaimed. He took off his hat and yanked off his beard and bandages. For a moment they resisted him. A terrible premonition flashed through the bar. "Oh, my God!" someone shouted. Then they fell off. "This is worse than anything." Mrs. Hall, mouth open and horrified, screamed at what she saw and ran towards the door of the house. Everyone starts moving. They were prepared, expecting scars, disfigurement, shocking horror, but nothing. Bandages and wigs flew down the aisles and into the bar, making a toddler jump for cover. Everyone tumbled down the stairs to the floor. The man who stood there shouting some confused explanation, with the image of a firm gesture extending up to the collar of his coat, and then, nothing to be seen. The villagers heard shouts and screams and looked up into the street to see wagon and horse violently unleashing its humanity. They saw Mrs. Hall fall and Mr. Teddy Humphrey jump up to avoid falling on her. Then they heard the terrible screams of Millie, who suddenly burst out from the commotion in the kitchen and bumped into the headless stranger from behind. There was a sudden increase in these screams. Immediately, everyone in the street started running towards the hotel, the candy vendors, the coconut shop owner and his assistant, the man in the rocking chair, the little boys and girls, the country gentlemen, the wise women, the old men in aprons, the gypsies, they all flocked to the hotel. In a very short period of time, a group of about 40 people quickly gathered. They're swaying, shouting, asking, exclamating, and advising, standing in front of Mrs. Hall's shop. Everyone seemed eager to speak at the same time and it turned into chaos. A small crowd supported Mrs. Hall, who was in a collapsed state as she was helped to her feet. A meeting was held. Incredible evidence from a witness who spoke out. "Oh, monster! What did he do? Didn't he hurt the girl? I believe he came at me with a knife. Headless, I tell you. That's not what I meant. Headless man. Nonsense. This is some kind of magic." He unwrapped his In endeavoring to get through the open door to see what was going on, the crowd formed a dragging wedge, with the most adventurous Tip near the tavern. He stood for a moment. I heard the girl scream, and then he turned around. I saw her skirt flutter and he ran after her. Not more than 10 seconds. He came back with a knife and a loaf of bread, stood as if staring. Just now. He walked through the door. I tell you, he has no head at all. You almost missed. There was a commotion in the rear, and the speakers paused to give way to a procession that marched steadily toward the house. First Mr. Hall, red-faced and determined, then Mr. Bobby Javers, the police constable of the village, and then the cautious Mr. Durges. They're coming now with a search warrant. People were shouting conflicting messages about the recent situation. With Ed or without Ed, Javers said, I gotta take a break, and I'll take a break and I'll go. Mr. Hall walked up the steps. He walked straight to the door of the living room and threw it open. Sheriff, he said, do your duty. Javers entered. Hall was next, and Vogers was last. In the dim light, they saw a headless figure in front of them. One gloved hand held a nibbled piece of bread, the other a block of cheese. That's him. Hall said. What the hell is this? A burst of angry questioning came from above the figure's collar. You're a damn bastard customer, sir. Mr. Javers said, but anyway, the search warrant says body, and duty is duty. Get out of the way, said the figure, stepping back. Suddenly, he grabbed the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall grabbed the knife on the table in time to stop him. The stranger's left glove was ripped off and Jeffers was slapped in the face. Moments later, Jeffers interrupted some of his statements about the search warrant, grabbing his unseen wrist and grabbing his unseen throat. He received a loud kick. Made him cry out, but he still held on. Hall slid the knife across the table to Vogers, who acted as gatekeeper for the offense, then stepped forward as Jeffers and the stranger staggered toward him, grabbing and striking him hour. A chair stood in the middle of the road, making a loud thud as they fell together. Get your feet done, Javers said through gritted teeth. Mr. Hall, trying to follow the instructions, was kicked so hard that a sharp pain in his ribs caused him to temporarily lose his balance. When Mr. Vogers saw that the decapitated stranger had turned over and occupied Jeffers, he retreated towards the door with a knife in hand, and met with Mr. Hucks and Sidney, who came to maintain law and order. Ricky Coachman crashes. At the same time, 3 or 4 bottles fell from the dresser, spraying acrid smoke into the air of the room. I surrender, cried the stranger, and although he had subdued Javers, a moment later he stood up gasping, a grotesque figure, headless and handless. Because now he even took off the glove on his right hand. It's no use, he said, as if crying for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world, to hear that voice coming from nothing. But Sussex farmers are probably the most practical people in the world. Javers stood up as well and took out a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. I say, Javers said, suddenly realizing the incongruity of the whole thing and interrupting himself, damn it. I don't think it can be used like this. The stranger slipped his arms from his waistcoat, and as if by some miracle the buttons pointed to by his empty sleeves untied themselves. Then he raised his calves and bent over. He seemed to be groping for himself. Shoes and socks. Why, Huster suddenly said, "That's not a human being at all. It was just empty clothes. Look. You can see what his collar and lining look like. I could put my arm." He held out his hand. Something seemed to touch the air, and then he jerked his hand away. Let out a high-pitched scream. "I wish you wouldn't put your fingers in my eyes," came a voice from the air, with a savage reproach. "Actually, my whole body is here, head, hands, legs, everything else, but I happen to be invisible. It's such a nuisance, but I do. Isn't that the reason why every stupid redneck should poke me to pieces with his finger?" Clothes, now unbuttoned and hanging haphazardly from invisible supports, stood up, arms crossed. Several men also entered the room, creating a buzz. "Invisible," said Huster, ignoring the stranger's insult. "Who has ever heard of such a thing? Weird, maybe, but it's not a crime. Why was I attacked like this by the police? Ah. This is another story," Javers said. "No doubt you do have a little difficulty seeing in this light, but I have a search warrant and everything is correct. It's not a stealth thing I'm after, it's a theft. There was a house broken into and money was taken." "Huh. And the situation does point to dash." "Nonsense," said the invisible man. "I hope so, sir, but I have been instructed." "Well," said the stranger, "I will go. I will go. But no handcuffs." "It happens all the time," Javers said. "No handcuffs," the stranger stipulated. "I'm sorry," Javers said. Sudden. The man sat down and before anyone realized what was happening, slippers, socks, and trousers were kicked under the table. Then he jumped up again and threw off his coat. "Here, stop," Javers said, suddenly realizing what was happening. He grabbed the vest. The vest struggled and the shirt slipped out of it, becoming limp and empty in his hands. "Get him," Javers yelled. "Once he takes off those things, get him," everyone shouted, and then they rushed towards the flowing white shirt. That was the only part now visible to the stranger. A clever blow from the shirt sleeve struck Hall in the face, arresting his progress with outstretched arms, and causing him to fall backward against the old sexton of Tutholme. After a while, the clothes were lifted up and twitching violently. It waved hollowly around the arms like a shirt being pushed over one's head. Jeffers clung to it, but only helped to tear it off. He was struck in the mouth while mid-air and immediately dropped his baton. A sharp blow to Teddy Humphrey's head. "Be careful," everyone shouted, waving their swords randomly but hitting nothing. "Get him. Close the door. Don't let him get away. I found something. He's here." They made a confused noise. Everyone seemed to be hit at the same time, and Sandy Vogels, as resourceful as ever and more sober from the blow to the nose, reopened the door and led the retreat. Others followed soon after and were blocked in the corner of the door for a while. The sound of beating continued. Phipps, a unionist, had his front teeth broken and Humphrey suffered damage to the cartilage in his ear. Javers was struck in the jaw, turned and grabbed something that had come between him and Huckster in the confusion, preventing them from meeting. He felt a solid chest, and then the whole chaotic and excited group of men rushed into the crowded hall. "I've got him," cried Jeffers, nearly suffocating, staggering through them all. Fight the invisible enemy with a purple face and swollen blood vessels. The men swayed from side to side, tumbling down the 6 steps of the hotel as the extraordinary conflict tilted rapidly toward the door of the house. Jeffers shouted in a strangled voice, despite holding on tightly. But he still struggled with his knees, turned around, fell heavily to the ground, and pressed his head on the gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There were excited shouts of, "Get him! Invisible!" and so on, and a young man, a stranger in this place, whose name no one knew, rushed in immediately. He grabbed something, but failed to hold it firmly, and fell on the policeman's fallen body. Halfway there, a woman screamed as if something had been pushed against her. A dog, apparently kicked, ran snarling into Hurst's yard, and that was it. The invisible man's time travel is complete. For a moment people pointed in surprise, then panic, scattering them across the village like a gust of wind scattering leaves. But Jeffers lay at the foot of the hotel steps, face up, knees bent. Chapter 8 on the way. Chapter 8 is extremely brief and tells the story of Gibbons, an amateur naturalist in the area. As he lay on a wide open prairie with no one around him for miles, thinking he was almost dozing off, he heard a voice nearby. Individuals cough and sneeze. Then the voice cursed rudely to himself. He looked around, but saw nothing. The sound, however, is unmistakable. It continues to curse with that breadth and variety which characterizes the curses of educated people. The sound reaches a climax and then dies down again. Finally, it disappeared in the distance, seeming to him to be heading in the direction of Eden. The sound suddenly broke into a spasmodic sneeze and then ended. Gibbons knew nothing about the morning's events, but the phenomenon was so striking